Hello, and welcome to week 5. And this week we're going to be reviewing some basic information that I want to make sure is on the record for the class, and also some general knowledge about radio staff and radio production. And there will be a quiz on this at some point in the near future. Okay, so what we're going to talk about is the radio business and the basic workflow of the radio station. And some of this we've already covered in some detail. Again, I just want to establish it for the record. Now, first of all, how does radio work? And that's actually an important question because in order to decide whether you want to be involved in radio, you really have to make sure that you know what you're getting into. Now, first of all, radio is free to listeners, and that's been true for a long time. And even with some of these paid services, radio is still basically considered free. The question is there money in radio? And the other question is, will radio always exist? And these are things that people are going to bring up. Now, fortunately, the answer to both of these is yes and yes. The fact of the matter is there is money in radio. And radio will most likely always exist. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be exactly the same thing as it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and as it is now, because technology is always changing. But the thing that most people who criticize radio don't understand is that the need that radio fills will always be there to one degree or another. And as long as that need exists, and as long as the phenomena of radio is capable of existing, there will be people on the radio talking to you, and you can be one of those people. Now, radio makes money based on sponsorship. All radio does. You know, whether it's public radio or what we think of as network broadcasting, terrestrial radio, at some point, in order for radio to take in money, somebody has to sponsor it. And as long as we understand this, we know that advertising is not evil. It is what pays for radio. And so if somebody makes money based on a radio show, it's because somebody saw an ad. An ad was put into the show. The radio personality mentioned some product or demonstrated a product. You know, sometimes it's more blatant than others, but that is definitely part of how radio works. And sponsorship is based on ratings. So the simple fact is, if you have good ratings, you're going to get more sponsors. If nobody's listening to your show, a sponsor has nothing to gain by you mentioning their name. And so it is a cycle that must be completed. Radio needs listeners. I cannot stress that enough. In order to successfully climb the ladder, so to speak, it's all based on people that are listening to you. Doesn't even matter if your show is good. It's a question of whether or not people want to hear it. You know, when I say good can mean many things. You can have an artistic show, an educational show. Those are good things, but that doesn't mean that people listen to them. You can also have a show that doesn't have any moral value whatsoever, but if for some reason lots of people are listening to it, then there will be sponsorship. But that doesn't mean to say that you can't have a good show that attracts attention as well. It really depends on the personality, which we'll get into shortly. Both large and small scale radio works, meaning that whether you're doing something through a major network like ABC, NBC, Fox, PBS, or you're just streaming in your basement using your laptop, it's all going to work out the same way. You still need to get sponsorship. You still need to attract an audience. And if you can do those things, you will succeed. Okay, so the radio personality is the person that most people think of when they think of radio production. And what that basically means is that when you're listening to a show, what are you listening to? You're listening to one personality, one person that usually you know by name, and usually that's the name of the show. And so, for example, if you've got somebody like Rush Limbaugh, who obviously has some audience, that's people listen to him, and that's the name of the show. But there's a large piece of financial real estate attached to that, all based on the model of sponsorship. And you can have somebody like Howard Stern, You could have all kinds of different people who are commanding some kind of an audience. It could be based on music, it could be based on sports, it could be based on just about anything. So how does somebody get to be a radio host? How does somebody get on the air? The answer is they have to generate an audience. It's a very simple idea. If people want to listen to you, then you have a it's a very simple idea. If people want to listen to you, then they will. If you are there on the air, then and people are tuning in, you will grow. So the host has to maintain and attract attention. So if you have something to say, it's got to be interesting. It could be that you've got to rustle up an audience. Maybe there are people that you are targeting, that you send invitations to listen to, that sort of thing. Maybe you do public events that also attract attention. But one way or another, the radio host has to get people to listen, and then once they are listening, they've got to make them repeat customers. There's got to be a reason for people to come back. They have to provide a steady stream of material. Now, the reason that's important to understand is that takes a lot of work, a lot more than you might imagine. You have to have something fresh to say every single time you go on the air. And oftentimes, this means that either you can't do it alone, you have to have a producer help you, or you just got to do a lot of show prep, and that becomes a full-time job. And that's one of the reasons why you really have to earn your place in radio. Even if it's music, you have to know what you're going to play next, you've got to know what you're going to say about it, and you've got to provide a consistent product. Now, the audience identifies with the host. The host becomes important to the audience, more so than may be obvious. You think you know these people. If you listen to the same radio host every day, you come to think you know who they are. But if you ever meet them in person, they're not going to have the slightest idea who you are, because it's effectively an illusion. But it's an illusion that works. So even people, if they intellectually know that the host doesn't know them, they're going to somehow think of them as a friend. And so if this is a friend that they listen to, they're going to go to them for advice by listening to their show. Sometimes they'll even call in and have conversations. That's always possible. The host becomes familiar and becomes a part of your life. So if you're used to listening to this same radio host every day at 7 o'clock, then you're going to make sure you do that. And so that will become something that will eventually make an impact on sponsorship and on radio and on revenue for the radio station. And if that leads to higher ratings, more sponsors will emerge and more money will come into the station as a result of that. And if that continues, then eventually you'll get wider coverage. You'll get a better time slot possibly. Maybe a different market will be added. Maybe instead of just speaking to the Fayetteville audience, you may be expanded to another state possibly. Simulcast, broadcast in some other area. And if that works out, you can go into syndication or national broadcasting. And so these are all sorts of ways that you can make money. And if you can get that far, you can make a great deal of money. But it all depends on the host. It all depends on the radio personality. Whatever it is that you're doing has to be interesting. It's got to work. People have to want to see it. That is simply the way it goes. Now, the producers or the production staff work with the host. And the reason why they are necessary is because while you're basically having a conversation with a microphone, you need to keep track of where you are on the timeline, and sometimes you simply can't do everything. You may get into a conversation. You may want to keep going. You may lose track of time. The producer is the person who's watching the clock, and they're generally the one that knows when your 15 minutes are about to expire, and you have to do a top of the hour or a station ID or something like that, and they will tap you on the shoulder, talk into your earpiece, or frantically jump up and down behind you. All kinds of different things will make that work. So the producer keeps the show timing, and oftentimes they may do research, they may attract sponsors, and they will handle all of the nuts and bolts. They may also edit and provide material. They may provide if you're doing a show prep, They may provide audio sources for you to play. They may bring in songs for you to play, things like that, sports statistics, all of that. All of the technical issues involving the show. And that could also include screening calls and promoting the show, scheduling live events. That's what the show producers generally do, because they're doing it for the show, not for the radio station as a whole. And this can also include social media engagement. And they can be the co-host. Who knows? You may have your producer staff sometimes talk on the show, sometimes just basically provide a supporting word from time to time. It all depends. Now, the show administration is a different matter altogether. So these would be the administrators, not of the show, but really of the station administration, or the network administration. It has nothing to do with the show. Basically, the radio executives hire the host and the production staff and all of those things, and they basically manage the station or network. And so their job is to make money. So they're a very different position than the people who are producing the show, because the people producing the show, yes, they want to make money too, but they also may have other motives in mind. So if your show is political, you may want to have a message you want to get out. That may not have to do with money, at least not directly. But the people running the radio station or the network, they're only thinking of money. And so if the host is a valuable asset, they will help develop the show, and they will nurture it. If it's making money, then they'll decide if they want it to make more money. If it's not making money, it's going to disappear. Simple as that, because that is simple mathematics. If they're not getting enough listeners to a particular show to attract any sponsors, then they will basically make that time slot available to someone who they do think will attract sponsors. And this all has to do with contracts, sponsorship again, and things of that nature. Now, the sales staff is really affiliated with the administration, and their job is to acquire and develop sponsors, make deals, and with potential sponsors, and do contracts and sell airtime. So essentially, they're selling a box of 30 seconds, possibly, depending on the nature of the show, or other blurbs that the host may say during the course of the program that are basically sponsorship. Many models for this sort of thing exist. Sometimes commercials are provided, sometimes they're made to order. The radio host may make the commercials if that seems to be the way it wants to go. Now, the technical staff are one more cog in this wheel, so to speak. You never see them. These are very different than the people that are the producing staff, the host, and the executives and things like that. These are people that don't even seem to show up in the building. In fact, they may not, because terrestrial radio has a transmitter which usually isn't part of the building. It's often a shack somewhere. It's at the end of the parking lot. It's usually an ugly brick building with a big metal door that's sitting right in front of the transmitting antenna, completely locked off. And the settings in that transmitter are rarely changed. Because if they are changed, it usually would be a violation of the law, unless there's a direct reason for the change. So basically, the technical staff is going to drive up to that booth with a truck from time to time, open the door, go in, look at the readings, and then make changes that have to be made if there's something specific, or they're just going to lock the door behind them and drive off, and nobody will ever see them. And this is completely based on the station coverage and FCC regulations. So if you have a situation where you've got a radio station that has a particular broadcast range, if for some reason they're buying their contract with the FCC allows them more, then they can turn up their power a little bit and expand, or maybe they've got to contract a little bit, or maybe they're getting a different frequency range, that sort of thing. Now, the internet radio has a server, and the server really does the same job as the transmitter would in terrestrial radio. There is some kind of a little black box somewhere that's sending information out to the internet, and that is basically out of the hands of the radio staff. It's there, we use it, but we can't really control it. Okay, so the basic workflow. This is something that you have to understand if you're going to put together a radio show, because basically all radio systems have a workflow, and usually it's roughly the same. More similarities exist than differences. Technology doesn't really change this, but it may change some of the specifics. So first of all, we have audio sources. We've always had audio sources. We've always had microphones. We've always had tapes that we have to play. We've always had some kind of thing that's an audio that we put on the system. There's a mixer somewhere. The mixer is what allows you to bring the source in relation to another source. The recorder records the completed project. Used to be on tape, not anymore. And then, of course, you have some kind of transmission. And this could be a literal transmitter, or it could be a streaming service. But it all pretty much works the same way. Okay, so let's talk about audio sources first. And fortunately, I don't have to talk about tapes. It used to be that an audio source was a tape. We've got microphones, but let's talk for a bit about playback sources. The microphones are a different matter, so we'll do those kind of at the same time. You talk into a microphone, that should be kind of a no-brainer. That's how it works. So the host is a source. The co-hosts, they have their own microphone they talk into. Those are audio sources. They're provided by the station. And so that's how that works. Now, playback source, like I said, they used to be tapes. It used to be you would have what's called a cart, which would look like a little paperback book. It was almost that big. And you put it into a machine called a cart reader. Or it could be a cassette tape, or it could be something like that. Or it could even be a reel-to-reel tape that somebody would have to thread up. Fortunately, you will never see that again. So now, most of your sources are going to be digital in nature. You're going to be able to load them ahead of time. They could be in some machine somewhere. They could be a part directly of the playback system. But one way or another, that's not something that's physical anymore. You also have auxiliary sources. Those are things that you might bring in that don't already exist in the station. And that's basically it. Now, the mixer is where all of those things go. All sources have to go to the mixer. If the source is not going to the mixer, then it's not going to be part of the show. Each source is controlled by the mixer. So the mixers have the sliders, and they're labeled 1 through X, whatever it is. And so you bring up the source, the slider, then you can hear it. You bring it down, you can't hear it. Now, the source input levels, some sources are all set for the same for each source. Source input levels and the source levels are set for each source. So if you have a very loud input, it could be that it's overwhelming the mixer. You usually cut that off with a little dial on the top so that you can manage it without having to micromanage the little bitty tiny range that you have on that slider. And so in any case, each of those sources are outputted as part of the mix. And so the mixer output levels are the volume of what's coming out of the mixer. And so that's where you would control that. So mixers have inputs, but only one set of outputs generally. Now, phantom power is managed by the mixer. If your source requires energy, that has to be turned on. Now, we've talked about that, of course. If you're plugging your cell phone in as a source, do not, and I repeat, do not hit the phantom power button. You will blow your source, assuming, of course, that it's not intended to take phantom power. And your mains and submains and effects are also internal devices that the mixer uses that could allow us to do things like having one audio stream going out to the recorder, which includes the microphone input, and having another that goes to the speakers in the room so that you don't have to hear the microphone input, which will prevent that feedback we talked about. Okay, now the recorder. The recorder is whatever the mixer outputs to. Now again, we don't have to talk about tape. You'll never see tape, thank God. Basically, these are now all digital machines that record this information. Usually a computer, could be something else, but it makes a digital file that can later be edited. And the recorder controls are displayed on the recording computer. If it's Adobe Audition, basically you're pointing and clicking to make it do things. Sometimes you have external USB devices that allow you to hit physical buttons. It all depends on the system. and the final output is rendered as an MP3 file. That is the file that you typically use to manage all outgoing audio. Now, broadcasting, finally, is what we do here. And the local server and the main server are how we do that. And so we have a server computer which is putting together a 24-hour stream of audio that is going out from the university. So this is one output, steadily using the internet to send information to a server. That server then sends it out everywhere. It's a much larger computer with a much bigger reach, and so it's sending a lot of information out in all different directions so that hundreds of people can listen to that same signal at the same time. And we have a scheduler built into our server which basically plays back previous shows and playlists and things like that. And of course it also will play the live shows if you set it to do so, which we've talked about. And so this streams content 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, even if nobody is in there. And once I said, if you are streaming your show live, which you should do during your live days, you should set the broadcaster to receive the input from the mixer instead of the scheduling device, and then it will allow you to broadcast out to the four winds. And so if there isn't a show that's coming up next that's also live, that you want to bring back the playlist so that if someone tunes into MU Radio, they still hear something, because we don't want to broadcast dead air. Okay, and that's basically it. It's just generally an update on what you need to know at this point in your radio career to make radio shows.